Hello everyone, wishing you a wonderful day. Today we're going to dive into a chilling question. What would you do if your own father apologized, but secretly kept searching for a way to prove the woman you love is using you? If you enjoy this story, don't forget to hit subscribe so you won't miss the next episodes. In that massive house, too big, too cold, Mr. Hoan stood like a storm that refused to pass. His face was red, not from embarrassment, but from fury that had nowhere to land, except on the one person he believed belonged to him, James. He stared at his son, the way a man stares at a betrayal. "I never thought my son would live in a place like this," Mr. Hoan snapped, his voice bouncing off the expensive walls and turning into something uglier. This is what you chose?" James didn't answer right away. He could feel the heat rising in his own chest, that familiar pressure he'd carried for years. Swallow it, smile, obey, be a good son. But something in him was already cracking, quietly, dangerously. Mr. Hoan's eyes narrowed, and then he said the name he'd been holding back like it was poison. Diep. Not just a name, a verdict. He didn't even try to hide his contempt. A woman with no father, no mother, dragging a child behind her. And you're proud of this? You're going to marry her? Bring her into our family and introduce her to me like it's an honor? The words hit like a slap, not because James hadn't heard prejudice before. He had, but because this time, it wasn't just cruelty, control, spoken out loud like a commandment. "Our family is educated," Mr. Hoan continued, stepping forward. "We have status, wealth. We don't mix our blood with—" "Stop!" James's voice cut through the room, sharper than he expected. Mr. Hoan paused, surprised. For a second, even the air seemed to hold its breath. James looked his father straight in the eye. His hands were clenched at his sides, his throat tight, but his words came out steady enough to hurt. "Why do you always need to control me?" he asked. "Do you want me to stay in your arms forever? Like I'm still a child you can move around like furniture?" Mr. Hoan's lips twisted. "I'm your father, and I'm grown," James fired back, voice trembling now, anger and pain tangled together. "I have the right to decide my own life." The room felt smaller, like the walls were leaning in to listen. Mr. Hoan's tone turned cold, the way it always did when he wanted to remind someone where they stood. "If you keep going down this road, you are no longer my son." That sentence, so clean, so cruel, hung in the air like a blade. James swallowed. He felt the old fear surge up, the fear of losing his family, his name, everything he'd been raised to protect. But then another memory rose in his mind. His grandfather's shadow over Mr. Hoan. The pressure Mr. Hoan once hated, the same kind of chain. James took a step closer. "You know what's funny?" he said, voice low. "Grandpa used to control you the same way. He demanded your life, your choices, your future. And you fought him. You refused to live by his rules." Mr. Hoan's eyes flinched just slightly. "So why?" James continued. "Why are you doing the exact same thing to me?" Silence. Not peaceful silence. The kind that bruises. In that moment, something changed in James. Like a door he'd been afraid to open finally swung wide, reckless, honest. He wasn't just arguing anymore, he was declaring himself. "I love Diep," he said, and his voice shook because it was real. "And if you make me choose, then I'll choose her, even if I lose everything." Mr. Hoan's expression turned hard again, but the damage was done. James could feel it. He'd crossed a line he could never uncross. And then, as if the universe wanted to twist the knife deeper, James's mind went back to what happened earlier. The blow, the stick, the chaos, the split-second decision that changed everything. The light in the room was dim, casting shadows across James's face, making him look older, heavier. He stared at his father and asked a question that didn't sound like a question at all. "You always hated her," he said. "But today, she took a hit meant for me." Mr. Hoan's eyes widened. James didn't stop. He couldn't. It was like everything he'd swallowed for years finally demanded a voice. "How do you feel about that?" he demanded. "Does it make you proud? That your unacceptable woman stepped in front of your son while you were busy proving a point?" Mr. Hoan's jaw tightened. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. James's voice broke. Just a little, and that made it worse. Because it wasn't rage anymore. It was fear. "All of this," James said, "all these mistakes are your fault." Mr. Hoan stiffened. "Watch your mouth." "No," James snapped. "You watch yours. If you hadn't made enemies with Dung's family, if you hadn't turned everything into a war, none of this would have happened." The room felt heavy, like it was filling with smoke. James's eyes were glossy now, not because he wanted to cry, but because he couldn't help it. He could still see Diep's body moving before his brain had even processed the danger. She didn't hesitate. She didn't think. She just protected him. "If anything happens to Diep," James said, voice low and shaking, "I won't forgive you." That was the moment Mr. Hoan's face changed. Not fully, not dramatically, but enough to show the first crack in the armor. Regret didn't arrive like an apology. It arrived like a weight, like realization, like a man suddenly seeing the consequences of his own hands. His eyes dropped for a second, and when he spoke again, his voice wasn't loud. It was smaller. "I thought," he started, then stopped, as if the words tasted bitter. "I thought what I was doing was good for you." James stared, breathing hard. Mr. Hoan swallowed. "But it turned into harm." That admission didn't fix anything. It didn't erase the insult. It didn't heal the wound. But it was something. One weak light in a room full of shadows. James stood there, torn between blood and rage, between the father who raised him and the father who was destroying him. And in that tearing, Diep's sacrifice burned like a flame. Not a gentle flame, a warning, a promise. Later, when the chaos had settled into exhaustion, James sat in a quieter room with a single device in front of him. A clear video. Proof. The kind of proof that could destroy a man's life. The supporter who helped him get it slid it across the table and spoke carefully like he was dealing with glass. "James," he said, "this is enough to send your father to jail." James didn't touch it. He just stared. The supporter hesitated. "Have you decided to do it? Because he is still your father." That sentence hit differently. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't judgment. It was truth. And truth is sometimes the hardest thing to carry. James leaned back, rubbing his face like he could wipe the conflict away. At first, he'd wanted revenge. He'd wanted justice so badly it tasted metallic in his mouth. He'd wanted to prove, once and for all, that control has consequences. But now he could see his father's face, older than he wanted to admit. He could hear childhood laughter that didn't match the man standing against him today. He could feel the invisible cord that still pulled no matter how much he hated it. "He's my father," James said quietly. "He raised me from a tiny baby until now." His throat tightened. How can I just say, "I'll send him to jail," and do it? The supporter stayed silent, letting James bleed his thoughts out loud. James stared at the screen again. No matter how much I hate him, he said, or what crimes he's committed, he's still my father. His hand finally moved, not to grab the device like a weapon, to push it away. Thank you, James said, voice firm despite the shake in his chest, for helping gather this evidence. He exhaled, like he was stepping off a cliff and hoping there was ground. But we don't need it, he continued. Please, delete all these videos. The supporter blinked. James, are you sure? James nodded once. Slow, certain. And that was the real turning point. Bigger than the fight, bigger than the threat of disowning. Because James wasn't choosing weakness. He was choosing not to become like his father. Still, forgiveness didn't feel like peace. It felt like pain with purpose. Like carrying a scar you didn't ask for, but refusing to let it poison you. Meanwhile, in another part of that same enormous, frigid house, Mr. Hoan sat alone. No shouting, no power, just silence. His face looked older in the quiet. The anger that had fueled him earlier had burned out, leaving exhaustion behind. He thought about the chase, the tension, the way his heart had pounded too hard for a man his age. My father is old. He can't run far, he thought bitterly, as if the phrase itself mocked him. I'm afraid he'll have a heart attack. But what scared him more wasn't his body. It was what he'd done to his son. For the first time, the truth sat with him without distraction. James had suffered enough. Someone had told him earlier, trying to encourage him, "You're smart. If he hears your feelings, he'll change." And Mr. Hoan had clung to that because it made him believe he could still fix what he broke. So he made a decision. He would tell the truth. He would show regret. He would play the role of a father awakening, a father humbled. And yes, part of him meant it. But another part of him, hidden behind the performance, was already calculating. Because while he sat there waiting for Diep to return, waiting in the cold like winter itself had moved into his chest, his mind kept turning. If James was willing to throw everything away for her, then Diep was the key. And Mr. Hoan, even softened by regret, still had one obsession he couldn't bury, proving that Diep was exploiting James's feelings. So, in the quiet, while the house pretended to sleep, hope and manipulation lived in the same room, like ice melting under sunlight, but still cold at the center. And outside, the night kept moving. Because the truth is, reconciliation isn't always a straight line. Sometimes it's a trap with a smile. And sometimes the next storm is already forming, right behind an apology.
Tập này đã đẩy Diệp và Jame vào tình huống căng thẳng nhất khi Mr. Phát gọi Jame gặp riêng và đưa tối hậu thư, đổi bình yên lấy im lặng. Ông yêu cầu Jame ngừng chống đối, ngừng điều tra và phải yêu trong bóng tối để đổi lấy sự yên ổn. Cao trào bùng nổ khi Mr. Phát lạnh lùng tuyên bố: "Nếu con chọn Diệp, con sẽ mất đi một thứ rất quan trọng." Jame phản kháng, từ chối ký bất kỳ thỏa thuận nào. Nhưng Mr. Phát tung ra một bằng chứng ghi âm giọng Jame từng nói "đừng nói cho Diệp biết", khiến Jame hiểu rằng niềm tin của Diệp có thể bị bẻ gãy. Về nhà, Diệp nhìn thẳng vào Jame và bắt đầu nghi ngờ: "Anh còn giấu em chuyện gì nữa không?" Kết thúc đầy rất an.